Daytime television has a specific relationship to personal history. The format allows for it, welcomes it, even structures itself around the revelation of personal background as one of its primary modes of engagement. But the version of personal history that daytime television's format produces is a managed version. The anecdote that has been pre-approved by the segment producer, the difficult period that has been resolved into a narrative of growth and arrival, the childhood that has been translated into a relatable origin story by the specific alchemy that turns private experience into public content without leaving anything that the format cannot contain. The question on the card for a mid-2000s daytime television appearance by Katt Williams was a childhood question. The format expected the managed version. The host was prepared to receive it. The segment producer had cleared time for it. The studio audience was in the configuration that daytime audiences adopt for managed personal disclosure. Warm, prepared to be moved, organized around the expectation of something genuine within the safety of the format. And then Katt Williams answered the question. Not the managed version, the actual version. In real time, in front of the live studio audience and the running camera and the host who had asked the question with the expectation that the answer would be the kind of answer the format produces. What he said was not dramatic in the televised sense of the word. There were no tears, no breakdown, no performance of vulnerability designed to produce the specific emotional effect that daytime television's personal history segments are built to generate. What he said was simply accurate. A specific, direct description of specific circumstances delivered in the specific way that a person describes something they are not performing, but simply reporting. The difference between the performed version of a difficult thing and the actual report of it is something that an audience recognizes immediately, even when they cannot name what they are recognizing. The studio audience recognized it. And here is the first thing about that moment that changes how the rest of the appearance should be understood. The host recognized it too. And what the host did in the seconds after Katt Williams answered the question is the part of that television appearance that has been described most specifically by the people who were in the studio. The host set the card down. This is the detail that the people who were in the studio have returned to most consistently in describing what happened after Katt Williams answered the question. The physical act of setting the card down, face down on the desk. Not in a dramatic way, but in the specific way that a person sets something aside when they no longer need it because the conversation has moved to a place where the card is not useful. Setting the card down on a daytime television set is a departure from the format in the same category as the late-night host who stopped consulting the card during the talk show appearance, a physical signal that the managed version of the conversation has been replaced by something else. The format is still running, the cameras are still rolling, the audience is still in their seats, but the specific structure that the card represents, the pre-approved topics, the sequenced revelations, the managed disclosure, has been set aside. What the host said after setting the card down was a follow-up question, not from the card, a question that had been produced by what Katt Williams had said, a question that the host had not come to the show carrying, that had not been prepared for by the segment producer, that was simply the next honest question to ask in a conversation that had become an actual conversation rather than a managed one. Katt Williams answered the follow-up question the same way he had answered the first one, in the specific register of honest report that he had been in since the format stopped holding. The studio audience, which had been in the particular stillness of surprise, began to respond, not in the managed way that daytime audiences respond to prepared emotional disclosures, but in the way that people respond when they are receiving something genuine, and the genuineness of it is producing a genuine response. The segment ran 7 minutes past its scheduled close, not because the production was unable to interrupt, because what was happening was worth letting run. The segment producer made the decision that the people adjacent to that decision have described consistently as the only decision available. The conversation was doing something real, and stopping it for the format's convenience would have been a misuse of the format. The format exists to produce engagement. The engagement was happening without the format. Here is the third thing about that daytime appearance, the part that exists after the segment ended and the cameras stopped running for that portion of the show. To understand what Katt Williams said when the format stopped holding, it helps to understand what the format was holding it against. The managed version of a difficult childhood in a daytime television segment is the version that has been organized into a narrative of resilience, the specific difficult circumstances translated into the background that produced the strength, the hardship made meaningful by what it led to, the origin story that the current career's success retroactively justifies. It is not a dishonest version, but it is a version that the format produces by selecting the elements of the actual history that the format can accommodate and arranging them in the sequence that the format's requirements dictate. Katt Williams's actual childhood, the specific circumstances of his early life before the career began to develop, contained elements that the managed version would select around rather than through. The foster care system. The specific kind of instability that comes with an early life organized around circumstances that the child in them has no capacity to control. The particular relationship to permanence and home and belonging that a childhood organized around those circumstances produces. Not a narrative of resilience, at least not primarily. A set of facts about what a specific person's early life actually contained. The daytime host had asked about the childhood. The card had a version of the question designed to produce the managed version of the answer. The format was organized to receive it. What Katt Williams gave the room instead was the report. Not the narrative, the report. Specific facts, in the order they occurred, described in the specific way that a person describes things they have processed and are not currently performing the processing of. He said what his early life had actually contained, without the narrative frame that makes difficult things acceptable to the format, without the resolution that the format's structure requires. Just the facts, delivered in the tone of someone who was answering a question honestly. The studio audience went still. Not the managed stillness of a daytime audience receiving a prepared emotional disclosure, the actual stillness of people receiving something they had not been prepared to receive. The difference was in the quality of the quiet. And here is the second thing about that moment. What happened in the host's body in the seconds between the answer and their response. The segment ended when it ended, in the slightly extended, slightly disordered way that segments end when they have departed from the format and been managed back onto the schedule, with the particular awkwardness that a return to the format produces after the format has been absent for 7 minutes. The host said the closing things that hosts say. The cameras moved to the next segment. The production continued. What Katt Williams had said during the segment did not become a public event in the way that the internet's infrastructure would eventually make such moments into events. This was the mid-2000s, and the clip did not circulate with the speed that a later period would have made possible. What it became instead was the thing that television segments sometimes become before instant circulation. A moment that the people who saw it live remembered, and that the people who knew someone who had seen it live heard described, and that moved through the culture at the pace of conversation rather than the pace of sharing. What the segment produced in the studio audience, in the people who saw it when it aired, in the people who heard about it from those people, was a specific question about the relationship between the comedian performing on a comedy stage and the person the comedian is when they are not performing. Katt Williams's comedy had always drawn from his specific perspective and experience. The daytime segment showed, for a few minutes on a medium that his comedy had not primarily used, the person whose perspective it was drawing from. The two versions of the person, the one on the comedy stage and the one in the daytime guest chair, are not different people, but they are different presentations of the same person, organized for different purposes. And what the daytime segment gave the people who saw it was access to the presentation that the comedy stage does not provide. The history that the comedy was drawing from. The specific circumstances that had produced the specific perspective. The person before the comedian. Daytime television's format exists because managed disclosure works. The format produces engagement efficiently without the discomfort that actual disclosure sometimes produces in people who came expecting something managed. What it does not produce, most of the time, is the specific thing that happened in that segment, the actual report of the actual history, delivered without the management that the format was designed to provide. The people who were in the studio that day received something the format had not promised them. Not because the format broke, the format was intact, the cameras were running, the segment was happening. But because, within the format, for 7 minutes, the person in the guest chair declined to use the format's protective structure and said what was true instead. That is what comedy's most honest voices sometimes do in the rooms where honesty is not what the room was built for. They say what is true, and the room, which was not built for it, receives it with the specific quality of a space that has been given something it did not know it needed. The card was still face down on the desk when the segment ended. The host had not picked it back up.